Good morning. It's really good to be with you today on this Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday celebrates the grand entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem to begin the last week of his life. As far back as the 4th century, Christians in Jerusalem reenacted this event in the place where it actually happened. And so today, as we celebrate Palm Sunday, we're joining centuries of believers in Jerusalem and all around the world that have reenacted parts of this Palm Sunday. So connect yourself, if you would, with them. For our celebration of Palm Sunday, it's so good to have the live music, isn't it? To sing our praises to Jesus, to celebrate this day. And I want to thank the musicians and singers for making our celebration really special. And I really appreciate also the children's ministry today as we hear the main parts of the Palm Sunday story. It's a part of God's story, just as it said there in the video. So why are we celebrating Palm Sunday? For one thing, it's a story that appears in all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that in and of itself means that it's pretty significant. Not all of the stories are in each of the Gospels. And so that does make it significant. It was a humble procession in which Jesus openly proclaimed for the first time, that he was the Messiah, the promised anointed one, as they did kings, the Christ, the Savior that would bring salvation to them. This morning, I'd like to go through the story to better understand some of its symbols and then draw some lessons from the story that we can apply to our lives. I'd like to read from Mark, the 11th chapter. The story's in the 1st through 11th verses. I'll read 7 through 10. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who were following were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." Here it says that he was riding on a colt, but if we look at another gospel of John, it says that colt, in fact, was a donkey. Also in John, it clarifies that these leafy branches that it speaks of here were palm branches. This was quite a royal procession that we had, and I thought that ours today was also quite a royal procession with the children. There's 3 symbols that give us a hint of the meaning of that day. The day, again, that begins Jesus' Passion Week. The first is that Jesus arranged with his disciples, as Sandy said earlier, to come riding on a donkey. It was a very symbolic act. It had so much rich meaning in it. It goes back to King David. He was the greatest king of all of Israel, and for him, the royal animal for David was not a steed, but it was a donkey. The donkey was a humble beast. It reflected David's identity as the shepherd king, when a shepherd was a pretty humble occupation. But even more important for the Palm Sunday story is the prophet Zechariah's promise that was given to the Jews. That was some 500 years before that. Let me read from Zechariah. "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Everyone in the crowd that day would have known these words. and the promise that would come, riding on a donkey. The people knew instantly what was happening. Jesus was giving a clear signal that he was the long-awaited king promised by the prophets. Finally, Jesus was openly proclaiming he was the Messiah. There are two other important symbols, and those are the palm branches that we've waved here today, and also the shout of Hosanna. Palm branches were a sign of victory and of celebration. They shouted also Hosanna, which means save us now, save us now. And blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. These actually come from a verse in Psalm 118 in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, which they would have known by heart also from childhood, because it was recited every year. Hosanna, come, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They have recited that time and time again at the Feast of the Tabernacles and the one feast that was coming up yet that week, the Feast of the Passover, commemorating the Passover of the angel in Egypt when they fled from Egypt many years before. The psalm was written, Psalm 118, to welcome kings back to Jerusalem as they returned victorious from war. It was understood to refer as well to the Messiah who would come and deliver the people. The people were hailing Jesus as their king in this royal procession. But there were two other processions entering Jerusalem that week, perhaps even that day. Besides Jesus, who came from the Mount of Olives and entered through the east gate into Jerusalem, from the west, from Caesarea by the sea, by the Mediterranean Sea, there was Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, who had probably at least 1,000 soldiers and magnificent steeds. They were preparing that week also, as a part of that time, to crucify a handful of Jews who dared rebel against the Roman authorities. And the other procession that day was Herod Antipas, coming from the north, not from the east or the west, but from the north. He was the ruler of Galilee, the son of King Herod the Great. Herod knew how also to use violence to suppress the people. It was he who beheaded John the Baptist. There were many who hoped that day that the Romans might give him rule over the entire land. Herod's supporters lined the streets as he entered the holy city, cheering as he arrived. When we hear the story of Palm Sunday and these three royal processions that were held that day, it's important to reflect on the choice that the people had that day, and that perhaps that choice is still ours even on this day. Which person would you have chosen among these three? Pilate, Herod, or Jesus? Who would you follow? Which procession would you join? Would you join the humble procession, as our theme today asks us? I recently read a devotional by Edward Grennan, and he had been following the NCAA men's basketball tournament, March Madness, as we know it, which personally is my favorite event, and I don't know if it's also some of yours. In his short piece, he was talking about underdogs. Do you remember St. Peter's University 2 years ago? A small Catholic school on the East Coast in Jersey City, New Jersey. In the 2022 tournament, they were the giant killers. Nearly made it to the Final Four. They beat Kentucky, one of those blue bloods we talk about, Murray State, which is also, I think, in Kentucky, and then Purdue, which is one of the number one seeds this year and has been good for the last few years. It was an amazing feat for a small school without the resources that others have. And of course, in this year's tournament, there's been some underdogs as well. It's been nice to see some of those smaller schools win a few games. The one that I followed the most was Oakland from the Detroit area, because Ohio State barely beat them this year, actually. And in the tournament, they were the number, 14 seed, and they beat Kentucky, the number 3 seed, and they're talking about, the job of the coach of Kentucky because of that. And that was on Thursday. Unfortunately, they went to overtime, but they did lose to NC State last night, I think it was. So Edward Grennan, it made him think more about underdogs. He wrote about Jesus as an underdog and Christianity too. Let me read this to you. Wasn't Jesus himself an underdog? He was the progeny of a revered He wasn't the progeny of a revered rabbi. He wasn't born to royalty. He was the son of a humble Hebrew carpenter brought into this world by a Jewish woman of even more modest origins. He had a ragtag squad of unemployed laborers in a small corner of the Middle East, spreading a simple gospel of love and justice that would change the course of history. If ever there was an underdog religion, it was early Christianity, whose adherents were persecuted and martyred, whose faith was outlawed by the Roman Empire. And yet Christianity prevailed, built upon a rock. I can't help, he was talking about, the underdog in the tournament. I can't help pointing out was named St. Peter. Christianity is still an underdog religion. Practice as Jesus commanded. We champion the poor. We defend the defenseless. We feed the hungry, clothe the naked, house the homeless, and love the unloved. Many of us feel like underdogs faced with the problems of the world, and yet every time we do the things our Christianity asks of us, we triumph, we overcome. I just love that reading. Which royal procession will you join? Jesus taught a simple gospel of love and justice. Pilate's procession was a show of force meant to remind the people of Jerusalem who was in control. Herod Antipas, like Pilate, knew how to use violence to suppress the people. But Jesus spoke in other places of loving your enemies, of praying for those who persecute you, and turning the other cheek when mistreated. This was and is a royal procession, but it is also a humble procession. Will you join this humble procession? When I think of joining this humble procession, this ragtag band of followers, I think of a movie that Katrina and I saw recently called Ordinary Angels. You've seen that, some of you? A few have. It's an incredible story of how a community came together in one of the worst blizzards in American history back in 1994 in Louisville, Kentucky, to save a little girl's life. Sharon Evans, if you will, was a hairdresser. It's her picture. She was one of these ordinary angels. But first, she was an alcoholic and a divorcee who was searching for meaning in her life. But she decided to follow the advice that she had received from a friend. Her friend, find a reason to be here that is bigger than you are. Find a reason to be here that is bigger than you are. She saw a headline in a newspaper, 5-year-old girl loses mother. In fight for her own life. And she said to herself something about that little girl, that girl without a mom, all those hospital bills, I think that I'm supposed to help. And help she did. The little girl, Michelle, was on a transplant list for a liver that she desperately needed. And when they called and it was her turn to get a liver, her father had 6 hours to get there. But it was an 11-hour drive by car to Omaha, Nebraska from Louisville, where she needed to be, to that transplant center. But with amazing work, Sharon was able to get 4 jets ready from corporate sponsors to shuttle them to Omaha. But when the call came, Louisville was experiencing one of their worst snowstorms in their history. The jets were all grounded. It's an amazing story of how God orchestrated a way through ordinary angels to get a helicopter and a pilot to weather the storm, and a TV station to push through the communications before cell phones were invented, for Michelle to get her transplant, which saved her life. It was truly a miracle. When you join this humble procession, a kind of ragtag band, you will begin to recognize that it's a royal procession. You're led by a true King of Glory and become one of a host of ordinary angels. You're chosen to join an amazing movement of unity and love and justice around the world. And as Sharon Stevens Evans says, and she continues to say, God is involved in this story, and just as it is in the true story behind ordinary angels, you can expect miracles to happen.